science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk as we continue our series examining the responses of intellectuals and practitioners and critical thinkers across the world to their new situation, to our new situation here in the time of coronavirus. Today I have a fantastic conversation for you as I speak to AbdouMaliq Simone, who is a par excellence imaginer, theorizer, and writer and speaker of the new imaginaries, of different imaginaries, of alternate ways of inhabiting, knowing, and being a part of the city, of the right to the city that he is describing through his work, focused almost entirely on what he calls the urban majorities in the global south, which is the peoples and their ways of living in places such as Jakarta, Mumbai, Delhi, Lagos, and other parts of the world. He has a fantastic argument in which he says, to quote, tries to discover the incipient formations of new cities and urban regions in the intricate relational meshes of how things get done. A city and region that are more inclusive and which maximize the resourcefulness of their inhabitants, that suggest new ways for institutions to concretely connect with their constituents and for the practices of residents to inform the operations of these very institutions, unquote. I have been listening to AbdouMaliq Simone and reading his work for a very long time, and I have a deep but untheorized acquaintance and familiarity with the kind of urban sensibility that he's interested in. We discuss that, we discuss his life, we discuss his response to the coronavirus, and of course, very importantly, we discuss his response to the protests around Black Lives Matter. I hope you like this conversation. It was an important one for me, and I think it covers new things which I hope to pick up in future conversations. Here we go. Well, first of all, thank you for agreeing to this conversation. What is your personal strategy to cope with the sort of strangeness of the present? I mean, how are you sort of responding at a personal level?
I'm too obsessed with work.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
No, it's not a good thing. Not when it's. No, I mean, because initially it was something that was cultivated from, like a couple of months ago, earlier on in this episode.
Yeah.
And people were saying that they were unable to work. It was so, and people not expecting anything. And so I sort of hung on to the sort of ethos of my grandfather, who worked the sewers in Chicago for 40 years, 6 days a week, and without saying much of anything, and regardless, and somehow that kind of a rhythm and a practice, insisting upon kind of was a way to temper some of the anger, because in a way when I was in Eastern Indonesia until the end of January, and moved from Berlin to London at the beginning of February.
Oh,
back.
Yeah.
Yeah, just back. And early on, I mean, then I had to go to work in Marseille for 2 weeks, and then So by the end of February, I already sensed that the UK was really in imminent danger.
Mm-hmm.
I just couldn't believe the way in which sort of, white upper middle class professionals simply ignored it and actively made fun of my partner and I, who insisted upon wearing masks at that point, and we were objects of derision. And
Really? Yeah.
yeah, and
You in,
whereas,
in academic settings, you're talking in academic settings.
well, I'm not talking about necessarily academic settings, but in in the neighborhood where,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
sort
yeah.
of, I know, yeah. Whereas when we left Jakarta at the end of January, and there was no indication at all that the virus was in Indonesia yet. You
Mm-hmm.
could hardly get masks because everyone just simply the initial thing was to mask themselves,
Right.
So so dealing with the kind of bewilderment at the response around me where I was living, it was work was a way to try to ameliorate some of this bewilderment and anger
But you
and
shouldn't have been surprised, no? I mean, you talk constantly about how the sort of natural, not natural, sort of more. I'm trying to evoke the beauty of your language when you speak. The built-in resilience of the majority urban cultures. I mean, they have, and I, I grew up in India. I have a little bit of a sense of, what you're talking about. So is that what, do you feel that the kind of well-learned response of the urban communities in places like Jakarta is more prepared naturally to respond to a situation like this?
more I think more attentive to the surrounds and the volatility of the surrounds.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I've always argued in some ways that the shape of urbanization within majority communities has been responsive to a sense of volatility.
Mm-hmm,
Uh,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right,
that and here in London, it just was more kind of exercise of a certain sense of privilege or a sense
right.
that not gonna it doesn't affect us, that somehow we're somehow immune uh, from these kinds of vulnerabilities. I mean, the vulnerability is, I mean, the sort of Western middle classes tend to live with a kind of individuated sense of vulnerability. I mean, the self, that's responsible for making it and articulating itself always in renewed terms, always perceives the vulnerability of its own composition in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I mean, this is a massive generalization, but I
Yeah,
feel
yeah.
like sort of urban communities in the South are more attentive to their positionality within a larger scheme of things and
Right.
try to calibrate and position themselves accordingly to something that they really assume they can't take for granted. They
Mm-hmm.
assume that won't be stable over the long run.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think that's
Mm-hmm.
in a gloss and very general way. That's the difference.
But it surprises you every time, nevertheless. I mean, when you return to the UK and you're facing this situation, it just sort of, it's like, does it still feel like a, I don't know, rug pulled under your feet, or disappointment and anger whenever you return to the UK and run into a situation, and then you feel that individuated response even to a situation like that? What does it? What is it? I mean, I live that also every day. Yeah, I mean, I live here in very privileged university setting, at least for me. Yeah, there's this kind of a schizophrenia I feel I cultivate, fitting into and kind of acceding to this kind of a individualized sense of invulnerability. That sense, I mean, you sort of fit in, and yet you are sort of alienated from it because you really feel that it's not connected into that sort of more responsibility based sense of identity. So, what is I've experienced as a kind of a strange schizophrenia. How do you experience it, if you agree with me?
No, I mean, I think the for me, the part of the difference is, I mean, for example, give you an example. Where I was staying when I was in Marseille in February for that short stint, it was on a street where it's quite an active street, many shops, produce. But it's interesting how there's a kind of gathering, a congregation of sellers of all different kinds of things, material, immaterial too. I mean, sellers that promise certain kinds of deals, promise certain kind of information,
Mhm.
and you see how these congregations appear within moments, within minutes, and they can dissipate in minutes when the word of the police are coming, or
Right.
and there's a choreography of acting in concert about where to put your body, how to deal with those that are around you, how to weave in whatever you have to offer in terms of what everyone else has to offer, so that it's a kind of a dance in a machine. There's an
Mhm.
attunement, there's a way of bearing witness, there's a way of of a kind of collectivity in motion that 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 within conditions of lockdown, or conditions where you have to physically distance, are are in some ways preparations for that in some ways. I mean, those kinds of things I witnessed in Marseille probably can't take place within the moment of the lockdown. I'm not saying that, but it is the kind of capacity, a certain kind of skilled action
Mhm.
is useful in terms of knowing how to move on the street within all different kinds of constraints and conditions. And what I felt oftentimes during this period in London is that the right to the city was being exercised as individuals insisting on having the right of way, the right
Yeah,
of
yeah,
way.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah, 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 yeah.
it could not be interrupted from the imposition of their trajectory of movement, that the way they had of occupying space and negotiating space was insistent upon a path for themselves, and it seemed to me to reveal a kind of sense of being in public that is so that the public world here becomes a way of rehearsing and articulating a performance of who one is,
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
as
mhm.
opposed to other situations where it articulates the possibility of being part of something yet being developed,
Yeah,
of which your part is not yet written in.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
You're being written as you try to figure it out with others figuring it out.
Right.
And that kind of sensibility, I think, is really is a critical difference in terms of a kind of urban atmosphere that I experienced between here and there, perhaps.
How are you responding to the George Floyd kind of situation and protests and response in America in this context? I mean, what do you think about the kind of protests that you have that seem to be, increasingly seem to me to be more than the usual, kind of palliative kind of a response. It seems very strong. Have you followed them, and what is your thinking about that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would, on one level, I would agree with Angela Davis when she says that this is a kind of unprecedented, at least in her lifetime, an unprecedented moment of both insurrection and opportunity to reconfigure the many aspects of the sort of apparatus of racialization that characterize so deeply the American ethos and I would agree with that, but in part reflecting the past years of a kind of organizing through Black Lives Matter that has been very much led by a new generation of young activists, very rooted within the specificities of local struggles and figuring out ways to articulate and suture those local experiences with each other across America in very productive ways. So it is a manifestation of something that's been building for quite a long time, and I think has real possibilities to change things around. I also look at it within a more global context because both my partner and I have been involved in a project in Eastern Indonesia, which is looking at the emergence and reconfigurations of notions of Blackness as a way of articulating, particularly youth from various sub-regional and ethnic contexts, looking at the situation in West Papua, which in the past couple of years has been a severely repressed region in terms of its nationalist aspirations, but also based on extreme racial oppression. But very interested in the ways in which an extended notion of Blackness becomes a vehicle through which particular youth that otherwise don't have much in common forge a kind of commonality within rapidly growing cities of that Eastern region. So the ways in which a kind of global Blackness is also being articulated at this moment as well. That said, one proviso, one caution in this is something that I don't remember exactly the context in which she said this, but I recall when Hortense Spillers, some years ago said it's not the job of Black people to save white people. And so as this insurgency, this massive mobilization, multiracial mobilization, emerges out of a kind of position of generalized precarity, where white people really feel a profound sense of vulnerability, life and death vulnerability that probably is unprecedented in their lifetimes. That one thing I would be cautious about is to what extent this emanates from that kind of implicit sense of salvation that Black movements now provide in some ways to humanity in general. And so
So you're saying, in the sense of it's important to be careful of sort of projecting Black sort of movements in places like America as somehow model templates for emancipatory struggles. Is that the kind of thing you're trying
well,
to?
in part, I mean, in part, I wouldn't. I mean, one that the specificities of racial struggle and racialization and the mobilization of race and Blackness is instantiated differently across the world, and it's important to recognize those kinds of singularities.
Right.
What I'm also saying is that the that what we'll have to see the extent to which this prolonged sensitivity on the part of many white people now to Black struggles
Right.
is sustained over time and isn't just a kind of reaction to their feeling their own precarity
Right.
and
Right.
matching their aspirations to those of Black folk as a means of some kind of redemption, some kind of salvation.
Sure. Yeah, remains to be seen. And that connects a little bit to that schizophrenia, a little bit that I was referring to earlier, I experienced, is that it remains to be seen, and what happens there, because the historical trajectory of this kind of solidarity is subject to that large textile of history, wherein its efficacy is who knows whether it is actually going to lead to anything or the other, not because of lack of intention or sincerity or anything, but because of structural reasons. I would say, the long textile of history. But I was also trying to get your sense of, you talk about global Blackness, which you just referred to, and then you talk about these sort of, particular resiliences of majoritarian, the global southern, kind of ways of living, this kind of adaptive sense of being in the world. And then there are these very locally emplaced movements that we are now experiencing here and have experienced in many different forums and ways. And it's feels like a Rubik's Cube to me, like all these things, not a jigsaw puzzle. It's not like everything's going to, in the end, fit together, and we just got to find out how to fit together. And maybe Rubik's Cube analogy is not also perfect, because in the end, there's a sort of a solution to it. But nevertheless, it feels like turning things in many different ways. And, you have a sense that it all fits together. But what are the lessons to be learned for the Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States from the experiences of people in, let's say, Jakarta? I mean, what are the lessons, do you think? What are the sort of intuitions to be offered up in solidarity?
I mean, I would think that if one takes the Black Power movement of the 60s and 70s, this was a movement that was articulated across a number of different registers. And so there was a kind of generalized discursive, masculinist, militant kind of performance in relation that was carried out largely across the media, and it was not insignificant, but it was in some ways less important than the openings that it provided within urban Black communities across the US for ways of putting together street and church and local government and social institutions in very specific ways and very astute means of not only changing the terms of sort of local everyday residence, but in mobilizing a way to chip away at having access to different kinds of state, municipal funding, opportunities to build new institutions, and 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 in a way, those kinds of organizing attempts seem to parallel the ways in which I have seen sort of majority districts operate in places like Lagos and Delhi and in Jakarta, in their ability to try under this rubric of Black power to begin to make use of the different manifestations of Black life within particular kinds of districts, and to begin to figure out what is it that we can do together? What is it that you can bring to the table, you bring to the table, in ways in which there was a kind of availing of affordances, of capacities at that moment, which was very, I think, a very interesting moment in American urban history. And I think that in some ways the Black Lives Matter draws upon that historical legacy. It has to deal with Black communities that have been increasingly dispersed from the urban core, increasingly underfunded, fragmented by all kinds of internecine conflicts, all kinds of pressures that weren't operative, say, within the 60s and 70s, requiring new ways of organizing. But I see those kinds of corollaries between a movement within the US that was very adept at being able to draw upon a diverse set of resources, and not to easily marginalize or judge, to find ways of incorporating what was there and putting it together in a kind of useful way. So those are connections I think that are important to draw. I mean, after all, I mean, it's interesting that even to this day, that like in Mumbai, many people from different sectors, walks of life, still consider particular districts of Mumbai the Black City. You know, the Black City being invoked as this kind of this place that's not yet still marked by, you know, sort of antediluvian institutions and economies and ways of doing things, you know,
Right.
stem from that kind of colonial division between the white city and the Black city, and this sort of racialized attribution of a particular way of inhabiting the city and operating. You know, it's interesting that how these terms get used, you know, and they do point to something very interesting about the kind of globalization of particular colonial tools of urban control and marginalization that are, you know, cut across, you know, the world. And yeah, so these kinds of connections I think are useful.
We teach in urban planning and urban design, and I teach in an architecture program with strong connections there. There's always this discussion of making our cities more sustainable and ecological and so on. At a certain level, if one just does the math, you know, the kind of extremely energy and resource expensive sustainability that we practice here, let's say in the United States, is obviously not sustainable at a global level. as multiplied by the world's populations. So there's a kind of a, there's a kind of a, on the one hand, I suppose, an implicit racism in that contention, which just assumes that the same level of access cannot be made accessible to everyone. And kind of the inverse thinking around that is that if we therefore want to really think sustainability in the future, then we have to learn from the ways of living in Jakarta and Mumbai, and the sort of resource optimization and fleet-footedness that we find in places like that. I mean, the models for future sustainability in some way would, out of economic, political, but even social and adaptive practices of the kind that I think you describe very well. For instance, do you think that's a reasonable thesis?
When I hear the terms of sustainability, with particular density levels, particular coverage of greenery, of waste management, management of urban services. I mean, I often see, particularly, because I know Jakarta better than most other cities in the last decade or so, I often see such districts already there, already functioning.
Yeah.
So you often ask, well, why can't this be generalized? Or then on the other hand, why are these areas under a great deal of pressure as well? This becomes complicated in a way, because oftentimes these particular districts are successful because they are manifestations of a particular kind of convergence of structural and local political issues, which are less operative now than they were before. For example, given their particular location, there may be a great deal of pressures in terms of affordability, in terms of issues like property taxation. There may be issues of balancing between the demand for affordable commercial and residential space. And sometimes the balance is tipped in favor of a kind of commercialization, making residence increasingly difficult. That is, there are sensitive tipping points in the configuration of these places that make them somehow vulnerable to when, for example, the kinds of employment that sustain people living there moves further into peripheral regions and hinterlands, requiring long commutes. Things like the land pressure in terms of gentrification, in terms of new mega projects, in terms of the development of new logistical hubs. It seems that instead of prioritizing or understanding carefully what makes these districts so exemplary of a particular kind of sustainability, get lost within other kinds of urban forces. There are also the strong discursive trends of sort of how you live a modern middle class life, and the emphasis increasingly on more individuated trajectories of value and success. I mean, you look at the way in which big apartment developments are advertised in Jakarta. It's like, be part of the modern world, be part of the globe.
Right. World class.
Forget tending to your neighbors, forget about extended family obligations, forget about all this stuff and think about your own aspirations, your own career, and I've seen many households that created really viable and interesting dynamic districts willingly jettison their residency there, in part because it's not that they don't think that it's not that they don't value it. It's not that because they don't think that they've done a good job making something that works, but it's their sense that for the future, something else is required. They don't know exactly what that is, and they don't know exactly where it's going, but they know that by increasingly trying to tend for the kind of sustainability of these sustainable districts, that somehow they're on the wrong track. How that happens is I'm not sure. But so I'm just saying that there are that within neighborhoods that seem to have been constructed in a way that work, that their endurance and longevity is, I think, somewhat fragile in the long run because of a lot of different factors at work. And unless they really have the kinds of municipal, strong institutional support and investments to help maintain them, it's difficult to ask residents themselves on their own efforts to keep the show going.
Right. No, I see that. I mean, it's an old post-colonial problem to sort of assume that access to a certain models of whatever it is, the West, is the privileged direction to be going, so that any sense of aspiration or most or sort of predominant sense of aspirations get indexed in that direction. So, in India, the big term is world class, so that gets bandied around. And then I also recognize that, it's not to romanticize these conditions of inhabitation, because they are problematic, becoming more problematic in many ways with disbursement, with further desegregation of employment and so on, as you are describing. And those are the arguments that are used to run these, kind of slum improvement studios in schools of architecture across the West. But in doing that, many of those studios, I feel, miss the learnings that they should be bringing home, which can potentially help reimagine and differently empower our own cities, our own, I'm saying now here, living in Seattle, in the United States. I mean, I feel that there's a lack of that two-way understanding that would be, I think, in the end, beneficial to thinking more globally, if you like, or about our future. I think there is some learning in there to be imparted both ways. And you teach here, you teach in the West very significantly. You practice in Jakarta and other places. Have you been able to sort of export out learnings back to the West in municipal conditions in the UK, let's say, and such?
I mean, what is easier is that for decades there have been these sort of iconic places across the world that stand in for the slum, the informal settlement, the slum dwellers initiatives, the architectural studios that you talk about, the political mobilizations, and that is it. I'm not saying that that's not important. It is really important, So, we've had the classic busties in Delhi, we've had the klong toys in Bangkok, the kampungs in Jakarta, the barrios in Manila. I mean, there are certain areas that stand in for a
Yeah.
lot of
Metonymies, yes, yes.
a lot of different things.
Mhm.
And they've been well written about, a lot of projects, a lot of learning. I guess what I've been attempting to do is to look at different kinds of territories that are perhaps not as poor, not as informal,
Mm.
but equally dense, equally, I mean, heterogeneous. Um, Oftentimes prob- have very problematic statuses within the kind of metropolitan context, but that don't have the kinds of classic civil society, community-based organizations. They're not visited by foreign scholars and activists. They sort of are on the map. And the thing is that I've been trying to find ways to put them on the map more.
Mm. Mm.
And trying, and that's basically been a kind of process of trying to thickly describe and find sort of language to convey the kinds of machinic operational functions of these kinds of places. And it's difficult to try to translate that into policy making, municipal official type terms, except when we can try to demonstrate that certain kinds of areas can employ this many people, it has this kind, I mean, so you mobilize the kind of traditional mechanisms and tools of accountability to try to demonstrate their importance in some way.
Mhm, mhm.
But it is always a challenge about that kind of mode of translation. How do you engage something which is clearly replete with all kinds of questionable kinds of practices, questionable kinds of authorities, difficult everyday life difficulties for the people who live and operate there, but yet provide something, and provide something that is largely constituted by the very same things that contribute to all that's wrong with the place to begin with.
Mhm, 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 mhm,
Can't
mhm.
really separate these things out easily. And so this is a kind of language for policy making, which is always a difficult conundrum. Because policymakers want to say this, we do this and it improves this and it does this clearly.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
And I I guess you just, I mean, the thing is not to shy away from it, you know, is to continue to, you know, and what's been much more successful has been ways in which local authorities, district authorities, are more and more amenable to understanding these kinds of dynamics. And in some ways, they play an important managerial, administrative, political role, even if their power is quite limited. But it's a start, and you continue to, and also you also have to try to mobilize the willingness of a lot of frontline staff within municipal agencies, you know, the planners, the monitors, the bureaucrats, that a lot of young people who really want to do a good job. And they're also looking for tools through which they can try to do something. And they recognize that a lot of the policy language doesn't help them to. So if you enable them to think through and what to pay attention to and to look for different hooks and ways of engaging fairly complex processes, then they feel good about that. And I guess that's an important engagement.
Okay, let's talk Coltrane then. The thick descriptions you just talked about. I would, I mean, I'm sure you've heard this before, but this sort of fat, amazing, I would say, musicality and cadences of your language and the way you write and you speak. Um, and what you described as this attempt to sort of capture something that's not easily accessible to the traditional languages of urban theory, urban narrative, even, certainly not to the romance narratives of the West, even 19th century, or Flaner, to even, some senses of Benjamin alludes to such things. But I think you're trying to capture a certain ethos, uh, sort of Jugadish worldview, or a Fada kind of a sense of inhabitation. Uh, but through language, just through amazing gestures of language, there's great um, emotion in that. I know you grew up listening to a lot of jazz. I seem to remember that in some lecture I heard of yours on YouTube, I think. Um, so I'm just interested in more about that. I mean, jazz has an improvised nature. You've spoken, so, and there's sort of an improvisation, I suppose, to in urban inhabitation that you're alluding to. But there's a sort of a pleasure in that living, pleasure in that music, pleasure in a certain deployments of phrases in your language, which I experience, which is quite amazing. And I'm wondering, how you feel about that, where that comes from for you. I mean, we teach creativity as a sort of a, where does this pleasure of language has come to you from?
Well, I mean, in part, I started out my life as a musician, so
Yeah.
I was quite good at it when I was 3, and spent a lot of my early years just very much immersed in music and not saying very much, as most musicians are wont to do. I mean, there's interesting this interview with Pharoah Saunders in the New Yorker a couple of months back, where the interviewer was attempting to press him, and Pharoah's music. I mean, it's I remember the in the 70s there was a memorial concert for Coltrane at Town Hall in New York, and Pharoah. So there was sets by Jimmy Garrison, McCoy, Elvin Jones, and then Pharoah closed it, and it was just the most amazing thing I ever heard in my life to this date. But the New Yorker, the interviewer kept trying to get Pharoah to like explain and with extremely elegant inarticulateness, Pharoah just, with a terseness beyond belief, didn't give, and so the contrast between how the words he used to describe his career and the actual musical production, so I'm always struck by this kind of relationship between language and music. And no, but I started my life as a musician, and so this was always, I guess, in my head and soul. And but in terms of the work as an urbanist, I needed a way, a modality, a way of being that could put me within and give me an architecture for the kinds of things that I wanted to try to describe. And that architecture is about these kinds of complementarities, reciprocities, give and take, interdependencies, call response, which I see as at the heart of a certain kind of capacity of districts to constitute themselves.
Mm.
And so insisting upon this as a kind of techniques just as music is a technical proficient, it requires, inordinate kinds of technical skills, in addition to attunements and inspirations, but there's the technical aspects are so strong. And I wanted to be able to have a kind of technical language through which to describe these kinds of processes that didn't depend upon a kind of social poetics necessarily, but really involved what is the kind of architecture through which residents are situated in terms of each other and what they do with each other and for each other in a very kind of systematic way. And so, for example, just the simple act of someone beginning to put a little stand in front of their house to sell single cigarettes is an act of attempting to make some extra money, but it's also a kind of signal, it's a lure, it's a test to see what kind of, it's a communication to one's neighbors, of a communication to say, I'm willing to do something. Are you willing to do something? But you don't say that. It's not like, oh, you get up and say, I'm willing, So all of these gestures, all of these maneuvers, which are both assertions and invitations, trial balloons, pilot projects, that somehow that the kind of notion of the ensemble, the ensemble that improvises, seem to be able to provide a kind of model in some way, an ethos, a modus operandi for thinking through these kinds of urban operations.
Mm. Just stupidly, maybe we should teach jazz in schools of architecture and planning as a sort of a way to get attuned bodily, at least, to this idea of, you know, accommodation and possibility and trying out things and sort of realizing that many things can be practiced, essayed without a clear enunciation.
I mean, when you think of the sort of history of the Association of Advancement for Creative Musicians in Chicago, now celebrating its 50th, 60th anniversary. I mean, it originated as a kind of institution that attempted through music not only to mirror what people experienced in Chicago, but as an attempt to find a language through which to address this kind of the multiplexity of the Chicago Black landscape. And that kind of consonance, in a way, I thought was very, very much generative, of seeing this as a really urban institution, but through experimentation with musical language, musical pedagogy, and an organization amongst musicians that attempted really to instantiate itself in those kinds of realities of South Chicago life.
As we move towards the end here, Invisible Cities, Calvino, is that a book that resonates for you?
I mean, it does in the way in which I'm very interested in the use of opacity, the kind of politics of visibility that are operative in many kinds of urban contexts. What do you show? What do you not show? What kinds of substrates of realities are there that just always remain out of view? a kind of aesthetics of relationality that never come to light in some way, which is a kind of, there is a sort of driving aesthetic force of the city, which doesn't make itself knowable. It isn't operable in the conventional sense. And so I'm interested in those kinds of dynamics. I think practically too, I mean, when I talk to my friend Gautam in Delhi now, who all of a sudden has been brought into the sort of state apparatus of provisioning, you know, we've always talked about how important operations off the radar are, but now the way in which the state that attempts now to try to provide some kind of resources needs to have people visible, needs to have things visible in order for them to be provided for. So all of a sudden, that which has been off the radar needs to come on the radar in some ways, simply to be accessible, to be availed, critical kinds of. So this play of this politics of visibility of things on and off are very critical matters, I think, of concern in any kind of urban situation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there is a lot of concern about the rise of a surveillance. I mean, absolute control of the rise of a surveillance society now with the virus and with provisioning practices, as in places like India with the Aadhaar card and so on. So it's complicated. I mean, now we are in the university starting to prepare for fall and contact tracing and apps for contact tracing, and it's complicated. How do you sort of in the sort of balances between visibility and invisibility? It seems increasingly technologies of visibility are burrowing their way into everything.
I mean, and then also what this enhanced visibility also brings to the table is an increased preoccupation with the notion of proportionality. That is, when I say proportionality, meaning figuring out, I mean, we now can, in a kind of society of calculation where everything becomes interoperable in a way, we want to figure out the proportions of things. So what proportion of the, I mean, the way in which educational records, psychological records, bank records, all these things are made interoperable. And so what proportion of a person's life is accounted for by what? Your genetics, your family background, your psychological profile, all these. And this notion of proportionality concerns me because it then raises the question of who is more or less important, who's more or less valuable. It provides a kind of calculus which once again brings in a kind of racism through the back door in terms of being able to have such precise, supposedly precise accounting for things, that who has the right proportion of characteristics, who's best suited for what, who's best worthy and eligible for what kinds of opportunities, and so visibility also has these kinds of impacts as well.
It's a catch-22 in many different ways. Wherever you turn around it, it's not easy to sort of. That is the DNA of the socius that you are in part describing. It is in some ways perhaps learning to be. Haraway says learning to stay with the trouble. Maybe it's learning to be comfortable with the catch-22. It's perhaps the thing. In some way. Anyway, it's been such a pleasure talking to you, AbdouMaliq. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Vikram.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.